Well, I've always loved history, even since I was in secondary school. And when I retired, I had a great opportunity to take that a little bit further. So I started with the Tuam Herald archives and looking back into the old newspapers. And there's a wealth of stories there in the old archives. I suppose the big houses are they're a very physical piece of infrastructure in the landscape. And you will look at them and wonder, who lived there? What happened to the big house? Did it fall into decay? Or was there a reason why nobody lived there any longer? And in Galway, we have quite a lot of them dotted through the landscape. I recently wrote an article about Castlegrove House, just a couple of miles from here. And it was a very interesting house and it had a great history. It was built in 1830. And it came into the possession of the Lewin family when it was inherited by Frederick Lewin. Fred Lewin wasn't terribly popular because he had overseen an eviction in the 1880s in the locality, and people remembered this. Now, he died in 1904, and his eldest son Tom inherited the estate. We have here a photograph of the house from 1895. It was described as being one of the finest mansions in County Galway. Descending again the short stairway, which as stated leads up to this important quarter of the dwelling, we traverse a passageway and mount the main staircase, which is of fine polished oak, broad and imposing and loftily ceiled, and find ourselves at top on the grand corridor long enough to furnish a walk on wet days. It is carpeted with crimson and set out with chairs, tables and settees in beautiful old needlework. And then in 1920, the house was attacked, and Tom and his brother Arthur were in the house when a group of local people came to the house, broke in, and demanded that they sell the land. And while they were there, they caused a fair bit of destruction. He boarded up the house, and the local parish priest told him that because there was a great deal of anger and tension in the area, it would be better for himself if he were to leave. So he did. He moved to Dublin. At one point, the irregulars moved into the house early in 1922, and they were billeted there for a little while. So on the night of July, 2 days after the irregulars left, they had handed over the keys to the housekeeper and left quietly. But at about midnight, a group of men broke into the house. The housekeeper was asleep upstairs. She had a friend staying with her, and they were told by the men present to leave immediately, which they did. And petrol was thrown all over the house to make sure no part of the house escaped, and was set alight, and the men left. So the house was burnt to the ground. Nothing was salvageable. Galway had a huge amount of big houses. Some of them were very large estates like Tyrone House and like Clonbrock and Woodlawn, but the large majority of them were much smaller holdings of lands. And they all, I suppose, they suffered different fates. Some of them, as I say, were burned, and then others simply were allowed to fall into decay. The owners couldn't really maintain them any longer, and they decided that it was better just to walk away from them, which quite a lot of them did. An example of a house that was rebuilt is Castle Hackett House, and the owners got compensation. Some of them simply took their cheques and disappeared, had no intention of rebuilding, didn't want to rebuild, like Castlegrove. Tom Lewin did not want to rebuild. But Sir Dennis Bernard Curwen certainly was interested in rebuilding the house. So when he got his compensation, that was the first thing he immediately started, work on rebuilding the house. This is a report from the Tuam Herald written a week after the burning of the house. The malicious, wanton, scandalous destruction of the fine old early Georgian country house at Castlehacket, built by one of the Curwens of Galway and for 5 generations occupied by his respected and popular descendants, is one of the blackest of the many black spots in recent history. It is the last of Castlehacket House. To think of the vile vandalism of the act of deliberately burning such old places with their rare and priceless old furniture, pictures and books, and memories of social life, is of a kind of savagery that no people in their cool moments could really be guilty of. Well, the editorials in the Tuam Herald were quite strong, and the language used in them was quite strong in condemning the burnings of the houses. This was not a sort of unusual with the proprietors of newspapers at the time, because the proprietors of newspapers and the landed gentry had a bit of a symbiotic relationship, you might say, until things became far more intense. And then the language changed slightly. The big houses architecturally were absolutely outstanding. They were beautiful. They contained beautiful things. But they were also symbolic of oppression and of British rule. And quite often, the landowners of the big house were often magistrates as well, and they were on the juries. So they were kind of a judge and jury over their tenants, as well as the tenants having to pay them rent. And they had no rights really at all. So this big house, although architecturally it was a beautiful building, it also symbolized something very much sort of gut to the Irish people at the time, and they simply didn't want to see it there anymore.